Guys, today I'm creating a 5-star Constellation 2 tier list. First of all, I want to clarify that this video isn't about how good each 5-star is at Constellation 2, but rather how valuable the constellations are by themselves. So you can make your own decision about whether or not it's worth for you to pull for a specific constellation, basically. The tiers are pretty clear, I would say. Probably except this one, which is about those 5 stars that have a very good Constellation 1, but a Constellation 2 that is not so good. So, let's start. First to be ranked is Navia. Navia is a nice Constellation 1 that basically reduces her energy requirements to almost 0 in every scenario, and a Constellation 2 that increases her crit rate for the elemental skill, so the main source of her damage. The Constellation 1 isn't consistently useful because she doesn't always need a lot of energy, specifically in those situations where she can use 3 elemental skills in a rotation. She doesn't need a lot, but the Constellation 2 is always very good. It's always a very big damage increase, so she's going here. Next up, Cyno. Cyno's Constellation 1 increases his normal attack speed, so it makes his combo slightly better, and his Constellation 2 is a big one because it gives him a huge electro damage bonus, which is nice. It's a very big damage increase where that's the only source of his damage, so electro damage. So for example, Quicken teams, but in Hyperbloom teams where he gets to deal damage with Hyperblooms as well, that Constellation 2 doesn't impact his damage as much as it could, so it doesn't end up being a very huge damage increase in that scenario. Still nice, but probably not a top tier constellation, I guess. Neuvillette, the best carry in Genshin Impact. This guy has very good constellations. The Constellation 1 gives him a passive stack for free and also gives him full immunity to stagger, so it gets to be used on double Hydro Furina teams while still reaching his personal damage ceiling, which is very good. And the Constellation 2 gives him a lot of crit damage for free. He doesn't need it that much because he already gets so much by default, especially when he has a signature, but it's still a very good damage increase in general. And overall, these two constellations are incredibly strong for a carry that is already incredibly strong by default, so I'm inclined to put it here. Before I move on, if you haven't done it yet, I want to ask you to subscribe to my channel if you enjoy my content, because it really helps me notice your support. Itto. Itto is a Constellation 1 that basically improves his stacks generation for the charge attack he uses, so it slightly improves his combos, and the Constellation 2 basically nullifies his energy requirements on the Mono Geo teams, so it can come in handy because Itto's energy requirements are not 0, and also if you use him with characters like Zhongli or Albedo that have elemental skills that can be destroyed by boss attacks or things like that, then his energy generation really gets put in jeopardy, so it comes in handy. Honestly though, it's not a big increase for his kit overall, so I will put him in niche. Lyney, the third Fontaine carry of this list. Just like Neuvillette, he has two constellations that are both quite great. The Constellation 1 basically adds an extra bomb to the first charge attack he uses in a rotation, which might not seem like a lot, but since each of those bombs does a lot of damage, it's a very significant damage increase. And just like Neuvillette, the Constellation 2 gives him extra crit damage during his rotation, so it's pretty great. Ganyu. Ganyu is a pretty good Constellation 1 that decreases the opponent's resistance to cryo by 15% when they get hit by her special charge attacks, which is nice, just not very good when she's paired with Anemo units or Zhongli. And the Constellation 2 adds an extra charge to her elemental skill that at this stage, like at Constellation 2 for her, is pretty useless. It becomes useful at Constellation 6, but for this list, that's not an argument. Albedo. His constellations both are focused around his elemental burst, because his Constellation 1 gives him an energy refund on elemental skill, which is meant for the burst, but he has a 40 energy cost, so he doesn't really need it. And the Constellation 2 adds defensive scaling to his elemental burst, which is something he should have had from the start, but it's in a constellation for some reason. But anyway, even at this constellation, I wouldn't say it's good to use Albedo's elemental burst in a rotation. Kazuha. Kazuha's Constellation 1 is okay, it's pretty nice. It allows him to use an extra elemental skill in a rotation, which is good for energy and also damage, because Kazuha's elemental skill can deal nice damage in AoE with reaction damage. And his Constellation 2 is far more useful because it allows him to give an elemental mastery buff to the active character that is within his elemental burst range, which is not that versatile actually. Like if you use it with somebody like Neuvillette or Raiden Hyper, it's not gonna be useful because those characters don't benefit from elemental mastery. But for amplifying reaction teams or Dendro teams, it's pretty nice. Just I don't think it's great or versatile enough to be put higher. Like there are yes pretty nice constellations, just not that good. Eula's Constellation 1 is pretty good. It gives her a free physical damage increase to a rotation, which is obviously pretty nice. It's a nice damage increase. The Constellation 2 makes the hold elemental skill cooldown as short as the press elemental skill cooldown, which is basically useless for her damage. It doesn't impact her rotations. Ayaka's Constellation 1 is basically an insult because it reduces the cooldown of her elemental skill, but she doesn't really need it because she can use it twice per rotation normally, and the Constellation 1 doesn't make her able to use it more, so it's not needed, it's useless. And the Constellation 2 adds 2 mini bursts alongside her main burst when she uses the Q, which can be a lot more damage if all of these bursts connect. But in single target, so when you're facing bosses, this only works when the boss is very huge like Dolpa, and in multi-target, if the bursts don't connect with opponents, they will just go away in their direction, so they're very hit or miss. I would put it at niche because the Constellation 2 can be good, but it's not consistently great. Shenhe's Constellation 1 is pretty nice because it gives her an extra elemental skill charge, which is great if you want to maximize your damage in short bursts, because you can use 2 elemental skills in a short window, very good for Ayaka specifically. And the Constellation 2 makes her elemental bursts give the active character an extra crit damage bonus while also extending its duration, which is great specifically for Wriothesley teams where Shenhe has to use an elemental burst very early in the rotation. So overall, it gives a pretty nice damage increase to the whole team, just maybe not big enough to be paired with Kazuha, probably, to be on the same tier as Kazuha. Hu Tao. This one is pretty straightforward, let's be honest. I basically made this tier just for her. She has a massive Constellation 1 that nullifies the stamina cost of her charge attacks, which allows her to use more per rotations and also makes her much easier to use. So it's both a big damage increase and a utility boost. The Constellation 2 is pretty low value because it increases the damage over Blood Blossoms, which is nice I guess, but they're not really a big part of her damage at all, so it's pretty useless to go for the Constellation 2. The Constellation 1 is great though, so she ends up here. Raiden. I already made a Constellation 2 Raiden video a few days ago where I basically say she's not broken anymore at that level, but she's still very good. The Constellation 1 is not that great, it's just a little damage increase, but the Constellation 2 is immensely good in terms of relative damage added, so I would probably put her here. Great. Just not on the same level as Neuvillette, because I feel like the latter's hyper carry teams are just more oppressive in the meta overall, which gives him a bump, but Raiden's are still very good. Child's Constellation 1 decreases the cooldown of his elemental skill, which in terms of damage increase is not that great, but it's actually pretty good utility because managing the timing with his elemental skill is not always that easy, while the Constellation 2 gives him an energy refund with the elemental burst that is not needed at all in his rotations theoretically. Still, I would put him in niche because the Constellation 1 can come in handy, I guess. In niche is nice. Venti. Venti is a Constellation 1 that doubles his charge attacks, okay, I guess. And the Constellation 2 makes his elemental burst reduce resistance to an emo to all the opponents it hits, which is pretty niche by definition because it's only useful for an emo damage teams like Xiao, Wanderer, and if you build Venti with the crit attack and an emo damage rather than an elemental mastery, it can be useful, just not consistently great, so niche. Xiao's Constellation 1 adds an extra elemental skill charge to his kit, which is decent to increase his frontal damage and also adds extra particle generation, which however it doesn't really need on new Pyrus and Constellation 6 teams, especially with the Xianyun coming in now. And for the same reason, the Constellation 2 that only increases its energy recharge while is not on field for some reason is not that good. Overall, very skippable constellations. I will put him in meh. Yoimiya. Yoimiya's Constellation 1 extends the duration of her burst, which makes it deal more damage, and also gives her a 20% attack buff if she defeats an enemy during the burst duration, which is not that consistent, but if your Yoimiya damage is high enough to kill opponents very quickly, then it's good. The Constellation 2 is far more consistent because it gives her a 25% pyro damage bonus when she scores a crit hit during the elemental skill, which is pretty great. Overall, she gets a nice damage increase from these constellations. I just don't know if I would put it here because Cyno's Constellation 2, for example, is just better. Like, I would probably put her in niche. Zhongli! Oh boy. His Constellation 1 to me is straight up detrimental because it makes his elemental skill cast an extra pillar if one is already on field, so it increases the upper limit of pillars to 2, which is pretty bad because if one is already pretty annoying to have on field, 2 are basically manic reaction inducing, and of course guess who has a Constellation 1 Zhongli in his box. The Constellation 2 is a bit better. It makes his elemental burst cast a shield automatically for every active character, so it works in co-op pretty well, and in single player it's still good because it allows you to use the burst in a way it's not a complete loss in the rotation, and since the burst also comes with immobilization for opponents, it's nice, just not really Constellation worthy to me. I will put him here. Yaemiko. This one is a very interesting case because her Constellation 1 is pretty great in theory. It's very similar to Navia's in that it allows her to regain a lot of energy, which is nice for a 90 cost burst character, but in reality she doesn't really need it that much in situations where she's played on field with Fischl as a sub DPS, because in those scenarios she already regains enough energy, and when she's played as a sub DPS, the damage increase she gets from that is not that big. It's not even a given that you want to burst every rotation the team you're playing, so pretty inconsistent in terms of being a damage increase. It's still nice though, and the Constellation 2 is very good because it increases her elemental skill damage by a lot and also increases the range, so it just makes her a more versatile character and a better sub DPS. I would put her in nice. Furina. Broken. Definitely broken. Her Constellation 1 and 2 are just so good. Constellation 1 makes their elemental burst gain a baseline of stacks that contributes to 30% damage bonus as a baseline, and also increases the upper limit of stacks the burst can generate, which is a significant damage increase for a lot of teams. The Constellation 2 makes maximizing the stacks for the burst very easy, like very trivial, even if you use a single target healer like Bennett or Cookie. And it also makes the extra stacks it can generate, so the stacks after the maximum give Furina a HP % bonus that can increase her damage by a lot, like it can make it very close to a main carry type of damage, which is just absurd for a sub DPS, so just incredible constellations all around. Klee. Klee's Constellation 1 is pretty decent. It makes her attacks gain the chance to trigger a coordinated attack, so that's nice extra damage. But the Constellation 2 is the true prize here for sure, because it makes her elemental skill reduce defense to all opponents it hits for 10 seconds by 23%, and that's a team damage increase, like it impacts the damage of the whole team. So not only it's great when she's used as a main DPS, like on monopyro teams, but it also enables supportive roles for her where she's only used for her elemental skill to reduce defense, and that's great, like that's very good. It makes her constellations great by definition. Kokomi. Kokomi's Constellation 1 makes her third normal attack generate a extra Hydro attack, which is pretty nice for personal damage and also application. So it's great for the teams where she's used as a main carry, both the triple Hydro teams with Furina, where personal damage is nice, and the vape teams with Lyney, where she's enabling vapes. The Constellation 2 basically just increases her healing all around, something that is nice to have, I guess, but she doesn't really need. She goes to niche Ayato. Ayato's Constellation 1 makes him deal more damage to opponents that are under 50% HP, something that is quite literally a 50-50 damage increase, I guess, which is not great to have as a Constellation. The Constellation 2 makes him deal more HP percent base damage since it increases her easy HP percent during elemental skill, which is nice. It's a nice increase to his damage. It's just that Ayato is not that big of a damage dealer in the first place, and the Constellation 1 is quite inconsistent. So even though the cumulative damage increase can be nice, I would put him in niche. It's not comparable to what Cyno gets for himself, for sure. Yelan. Yelan's Constellation 1 adds an extra elemental skill charge to her kit, which is great for particle generation and for damage because it adds front load damage to her kit, which is nice. The Constellation 2 makes her burst trigger a extra coordinated attack every 2 seconds, which again increases her damage and also her utility because it makes her apply more Hydro. So it makes her more self-sufficient as a unit because it makes her better in solo Hydro situations, and that's great. Nilou. Nilou's Constellation 1 increases some of the damage dealt by her elemental skill, which is not that relevant, but it also increases the duration of the ring the skill creates, which increases her Hydro application, and that means more blooms, which is nice. The Constellation 2 makes the bloom the team generates reduce resistance to Hydro and Dendro by 35% on all the opponents they hit, which is great. It's a very big damage increase for the bloom teams of Nilou, so if you plan to use her, it's a very big increase, very significant, and yeah, great. Nahida. The Constellation 1 makes her elemental burst extra effects that are tied to team building easier to get, it just makes the utility of the burst better, so that's nice. The Constellation 2 is obviously the big one because it increases the team damage of basically all the Dendro teams by a lot. You get a defense reduction on all quicken procs, you get a crit multiplier on bloom and burning procs, so it's very good. It's a damage increase that is relative to Nilou's Constellation 2, but on a much wider array of teams, so yeah, top tier. Just not broken tier because I think Furina's Constellations are just straight up better. Wanderer. Wanderer's Constellation 1 increases his normal and charge attack speed, and it also makes the little bolts he creates while dodging deal more damage, so in practice that's a pretty significant damage increase. The Constellation 2 increases the damage of his elemental burst if it's used in the second part of his elemental skill window, which is very nice. It's a nice damage increase on an AoE scale, so it's pretty relevant. It's a nice tool to end things usually, and yeah, it's a great damage increase for a pretty nice carry. Haitham. Haytham's Constellation 1 makes the mirror procs his elemental skill effect creates reduce the cooldown of the elemental skill itself, which can be nice in very specific situations and in some very specific rotations. It's just not that consistent as a positive effect. The Constellation 2 is an elemental mastery boost based on how many mirrors he has, so it's a nice damage increase. Just not good enough to be great. It's just a nice damage increase for a great carry. Baizhu. Baiju's Constellation 1 is okay. It adds an extra charge to his elemental skill, which is mostly great for particle generation because it's not really needed in terms of healing. The Constellation 2 is much more interesting because it adds a guaranteed Dendro off field effect that can be triggered even if it doesn't ever come on field. So it's pretty interesting. It's a pretty unique constellation. It has uses in speedruns, especially with Neuvillette teams. So yeah, niche. Wriothesley. Wriothesley's Constellation 1 basically changes his first passive by giving his charge attack a very consistent massive damage increase and also making their healing effects very consistent. It's very good for melt teams specifically where the damage of the charge attacks can be amplified consistently through melts, but it's good in general. It's a very good constellation, and the Constellation 2 is basically the same as Wanderer's really. It increases his elemental burst damage, and yeah, that's nice because it's a nice nuke. Wait, I just realized I forgot about the standard 5 stars for this tier list.